The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dusty town of Rustler's Ridge. A wind picked up, sweeping the dry dirt into little whirlwinds across the streets as the last remnants of daylight began to fade. The town was a typical Wild West outpost, small, quiet, and not a place for anyone with high hopes. But Clay Harris wasn't looking for anything more than a few quiet nights and a cold drink at the saloon. A cowboy, as rough and rugged as the land itself, he had no business with anything else. He was just passing through. That is, until he saw her. She stood in front of the saloon doors, her silhouette framed by the yellow glow of lantern light. The contrast between her and the town was stark. Where the men of Rustler's Ridge had the look of hard-working, dirt-covered folks who barely saw beyond the horizon, she looked out of place. In the fading light, he could see she was dressed in a fine, deep purple dress that shimmered with gold thread, the kind of dress you might find in a big city. The kind of dress that made a man wonder where she'd come from, and how she ended up in a dusty town like this. Her horse stood behind her, a fine mare with a glossy black coat, tethered to a post as though she belonged to a higher class than the usual riders who passed through. She hadn't been here long, that much was clear. The horse was fresh, and the saddle looked untouched, save for the dust from the road. Clay had just come from a hard day's ride, his muscles aching from hours in the saddle. He didn't feel like getting involved in anything strange or complicated, but something about the woman caught his attention. He couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way her eyes locked onto him, searching him, sizing him up like a horse at auction. She took a step toward him, and he tilted his head, wiping the sweat from his brow. She was close now, close enough for him to see the hard set of her jaw, the determination in her posture. She wasn't a woman who was used to being ignored. "You a man who knows how to handle a situation?" she asked, her voice low, but clear. Clay frowned, confused. "That depends on the situation, ma'am." The woman glanced around, then stepped closer, just enough so that no one else could hear. "I need a husband," she said, her voice tight, almost desperate. "Tonight, I'll pay you $10,000. Clay raised an eyebrow. $10,000 wasn't something a man like him usually heard in a town like this, not unless it came from a land baron, a cattle thief, or someone willing to break a few laws. She reached into her bag and pulled out a large wad of bills, pressing it into his hand. It felt real, heavy, far more than a day's wages for any cowboy in these parts. Clay looked at her, then back at the money, his mind racing. "Why?" he asked, though he was already starting to form a few conclusions. There were whispers, rumors about women who came to town desperate for a way out, or those who needed to escape from something. Maybe she was just another poor soul on the run. "I need you to stand with me," she replied, her eyes meeting his, the weight of her words pressing into him. "At the church. You don't have to say a word. Just stand beside me while I make my vows. Nothing else." Clay's brow furrowed in confusion. "You want me to stand at the altar with you?" His voice was low, a mix of disbelief and growing concern. There was something in her eyes, something that told him this wasn't a simple, harmless request. "Yes," she confirmed. "And then you can take the money, walk away, and never see me again. Just don't ask questions." Clay eyed her for a long moment, the weight of her offer hanging in the air like the stillness before a thunderstorm. He wasn't in the business of making rash decisions, but there was something about her, the edge to her voice, the way her jaw clenched, as if she was holding back a storm of her own. His gaze shifted to the money in his hand. $10,000 would buy a lot of whiskey. It could buy a decent piece of land, maybe even a horse worth riding. 1,000 things raced through his mind, but still, it didn't make sense. "You're asking me to marry you, ma'am." He made sure to emphasize the word. "Ain't no way a man should stand at an altar with no promises." She nodded sharply, a little too quickly. "That's right." He scratched his chin, considering. You sure it's me you want? You look like you could get any man in this town. Her eyes hardened. There are no men in this town. Not the kind I need. She turned away for a brief moment, then looked back at him. And besides, I've already paid you. Clay's eyes flicked to the money again, then back up to her face. She was still tense, almost on the edge of breaking, but also entirely certain. She had made up her mind, and it was clear if he turned her down, she'd find someone else. She didn't need him. Not really. But there was a wild, frantic energy in her eyes that made Clay wonder what she had been running from, and why she'd come to him, a cowboy from out of town, to play the role of husband for a night. I'll do it, Clay finally said, his voice gruff, filled with that edge of uncertainty. But you tell me what this is really about. You ain't giving me no story about how some fella done you wrong, are you? She looked at him, her face a mask of emotion, and for just a second, he thought she might finally tell him what was eating at her. But instead, she shook her head and smiled faintly. No, she said. I'm not asking for your sympathy, cowboy. Just do your part, and this will be over. Before he could respond, she was already turning and heading back toward the church. Clay watched her walk away, still gripping the money in his hand. Something wasn't right, but $10,000 was $10,000, and when a man like him was on the edge of nowhere, sometimes you took what you could get. Clay had never been a man to ask too many questions, especially when the answers didn't matter to him. But as he made his way to the church, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this situation wasn't right. This wasn't the kind of thing a man like him should get involved with. And yet, something pulled him forward, something that had little to do with the $10,000 she had offered and everything to do with the storm he sensed brewing inside her. He could feel it in the air, a dangerous undercurrent that pulled at him, even as his boots scraped the dust beneath him. When he'd agreed to her strange proposition earlier that day, it had seemed simple enough. 1,000 things went through his mind in the heat of the moment. The money had certainly been tempting. It wasn't every day a cowboy got an offer like that. But now that he was standing outside the church, a chill ran down his spine as he thought about it again. Why had she asked him? Why him? He wasn't anyone special, just a cowboy passing through. Still, he couldn't deny the curiosity that gnawed at him, the way she looked at him with a sharp intensity. She was desperate, that much was clear. But desperate enough to pay for a man's company for one night. It didn't sit well with him, and yet, here he was, drawn into a situation that felt far more complicated than he had expected. The sun had set completely, and the dark sky stretched above him like a velvet cloak. The street lamps flickered weakly in the distance as Clay approached the weathered church. It wasn't the first time he'd seen it, but tonight, it felt different, hollow, ominous. The whitewashed walls, once pristine, had long since lost their luster, now stained by the passage of time and the harsh winds of the west. The steeple, which had once stood tall, now seemed a little more bent, a little more crooked, as if the weight of its age had begun to lean in on itself. This place had been abandoned long ago, the town's residents preferring the saloon or their own homes for whatever semblance of solace they could find. As Clay pushed open the heavy wooden doors, they groaned in protest. Inside, the church smelled of old wood and dust. The faint flicker of candlelight cast long, wavering shadows across the room. The pews were empty, save for the woman, who stood near the altar with her back to him. She was alone. For a moment, he considered turning back, but his boots were already on the threshold, and he didn't like to back out once he'd made up his mind. His mind had made its decision before he even stepped into the church. He would follow through. It wasn't just about the money anymore. The way she'd looked at him when she asked him to do this, it was like she was asking him to be part of a story he couldn't quite understand. She turned when she heard him step inside. Her face was set, unreadable, but the tension in her posture was unmistakable. For all her beauty, there was something hardened about her, like someone who had been through more than they should have. and now the world had started to erode them from the inside out. Clay stepped further into the room, his footsteps echoing across the empty church. "I came," he said, his voice low, hesitant. He wasn't sure what to say. What did a man say in a place like this, at a moment like this? "I knew you would," she said, her voice soft but firm. She didn't look at him. Instead, her eyes were focused on the altar, and there was a quiet determination about her as she moved toward it. She had said nothing else when he arrived, but her gaze had been enough to tell him she was prepared to see this through. He followed her. The silence between them hung heavy, as if it were a third party in the room. "Are you sure about this?" Clay asked, his voice breaking through the stillness. "What is it that you really want from me, lady?" She didn't answer immediately, her fingers resting on the edge of the altar. There was a moment of hesitation before she spoke again. "I don't need a man. I just need to get through tonight." Clay felt his confusion deepen. Get through tonight? Get through what? She took a breath, her shoulders rising and falling like a weight lifting and settling. "That's none of your concern. You've done your part by agreeing. The rest is mine to deal with." Clay could feel the distance between them grow, not in physical space, but in the weight of her words, in the finality of her tone. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger than what either of them had bargained for. Still, he couldn't back out now. She'd paid him $10,000. The job was done. Or was it? "All right," Clay said, trying to push past the unease. "I'm here. You got what you wanted. Now, what happens?" Before she could answer, the door to the church creaked open behind them. The sound was low and slow, the kind of noise that made the hairs on the back of Clay's neck stand up. He turned instinctively, his hand sliding toward the gun at his side. The figure that entered was an old man, a preacher, by the look of him. His robe was worn, his face lined with age and wear. There was something tired about the way he moved, like a man who had seen too many years pass by and had no illusions left about the world. He didn't seem surprised to see them there, didn't look at either of them with anything but indifference. "You're here, then," he said, his voice gravelly, like it hadn't been used in years. He walked slowly toward the altar, his eyes passing over Clay and the woman as though they were merely another set of things to be done. Clay didn't respond. He stood still, watching as the preacher approached the front, pulling a worn Bible from beneath his robe. "Ready?" the preacher asked, his voice echoing faintly in the large, empty space. The woman nodded. "I'm ready." Clay felt the weight of the moment settle on him, pressing against his chest. Something was off, something in the air, something in the way she said it. But what could he do? She had paid him. He had no reason not to finish what he'd started. It wasn't like he hadn't been in tight spots before, and he could feel the eyes of the preacher on him, waiting for him to step up. The woman's hand moved toward the small box she had been carrying, and for a moment, Clay thought she was going to pull out something else, something more dangerous than just a ring. But instead, she held it out toward him. The box was small, about the size of a man's palm. When he took it from her, the smooth weight of it surprised him. Inside was a simple gold ring, thin but solid, nothing fancy. It was the kind of ring a cowboy might wear if he was willing to settle down. But the stone set in the middle, it was dark, almost black, and as Clay turned it in his fingers, the light flickered strangely off its surface. He slipped it on. The cold metal against his skin sent a shiver up his spine. "Now," the woman said, her voice sharper than before, "we do this." The preacher began speaking the vows, his voice low and steady, but when it was Clay's turn to speak, the words stuck in his throat. He couldn't do it. Not like this. Not under these circumstances. But the woman was looking at him again, her eyes fierce and demanding. "Say it," she whispered. "Say it. You promised." The words were like a command, and without thinking, Clay opened his mouth. "I do," he said. The words came out, heavy and final. The preacher nodded. marking the moment in the Bible. The ceremony was done, but there was no celebration, no joy. The woman didn't smile, didn't give any indication that this had been what she'd been seeking. Instead, she stood there, almost as though the weight of the moment had crushed her too. And then, just as the preacher was about to offer his final blessing, the woman's hand shot out, quick as a rattlesnake. She drew a Colt revolver from beneath her dress and leveled it at Clay's chest. The room went still. The preacher froze. For a moment, no one moved. Clay's hand instinctively reached for his gun, but he didn't draw it. He didn't want to escalate this. Her eyes never left his as she held the gun steady. "You stay quiet," she said, her voice tight with emotion. For the longest time, no one spoke. The preacher looked like he was about to collapse. The tension was thick, suffocating. But Clay didn't move. He kept his eyes on her, watching for any sign of what came next. What had he just walked into? And then, without a word, she lowered the gun. The room exhaled in unison, as if everyone had been holding their breath. But Clay didn't feel relieved. Not yet. She didn't say another word. She simply turned and walked out of the church, leaving Clay standing there with the ring on his finger and the lingering scent of danger hanging in the air. What was this woman running from? What had he just agreed to? As the door creaked open, Clay felt the weight of the night settle on his shoulders. This was far from over. Whatever had started here, whatever game she was playing, it wasn't finished. And he wasn't sure whether he was a pawn or a player. But one thing was certain, he wasn't walking away unscathed. Clay stood in the doorway of the church, the night air biting at his skin, the cold creeping in as he watched the woman walk into the darkened street. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the stillness of the night, but there was no hesitation in her gait. She knew where she was going. She knew what was next. But Clay, for the first time in his life, had no idea what came after this. He looked down at the ring still on his finger. It was a simple band of gold, unadorned save for the dark stone in the center. The chill of the night air seemed to make the ring grow heavier, and for the first time, Clay felt the weight of his actions. He had agreed to something he didn't fully understand, and now there was no turning back. The preacher stood in the back of the church, his hands shaking as he stared at the altar, still unsure of what had just occurred. Clay didn't speak to him. The man didn't matter. All that mattered was the woman who had pulled him into this, who had led him down a path he hadn't been prepared for. Clay pushed the door open and stepped out into the night. The street was empty, save for the faint glow of the lamps flickering in the distance. The town of Rustler's Ridge had never seemed smaller, its streets more narrow, its silence more suffocating. He looked toward the saloon, but the woman wasn't there. She was already gone. His mind raced. Was she running from someone? Or was this all just a game? The way she had held the gun to his chest, the coldness in her eyes. It hadn't been a threat. It had been a promise, a warning. But a warning about what? What was it that she needed from him? Why had she chosen him for this? Clay hadn't made it far when he heard it, the sound of hooves in the distance, the rapid beat of several horses galloping toward the town. It wasn't the usual clop-clop of a cowboy on a leisurely ride. This was urgent, frantic, like someone was running out of time. Clay's hand instinctively went to his gun, his fingers brushing the familiar handle. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see a group of outlaws or troublemakers, but what he saw instead stopped him cold. A rider, a lone figure in the distance, was coming in fast. As the rider drew closer, Clay could make out the details: a man in a long coat, face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. There was something about him that made Clay's instincts flare, the same way he'd react to danger in the wild. This man wasn't just riding into town. He was looking for something, or someone. The rider slowed as he approached the edge of town. He pulled up his horse, eyeing Clay with a cold, calculated gaze. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The tension between them was palpable. Clay could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the stranger dismounted with a slow, deliberate motion. "You looking for someone, stranger?" Clay asked, keeping his hand close to his holster. The man's eyes never left Clay's as he straightened, brushing dust from his coat. "Not just anyone. I'm looking for a woman," the man replied, his voice rough but controlled. Clay didn't like the sound of that. "What woman?" The man shifted his weight, his boots scraping against the dirt road. "A woman who was in this town tonight," he said. "She was supposed to be at the church." Clay's gut tightened. He knew exactly who the man was talking about. "I don't know where she is," he said, his voice low, steady. "I'm just a passerby. I don't get mixed up in other people's business." The stranger's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Clay thought he might draw on him. But the man didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I'm not asking for your help," the man said, his voice cold. "I'm telling you, she's in danger. If you know where she went, you better tell me now." Clay didn't flinch. He wasn't a man who gave in easily, especially not to threats. But something in the man's tone, the urgency in his voice, made Clay pause. There was something else here, something deeper. "Who are you?" Clay asked, his voice hardening. The stranger's eyes flickered with a flash of anger, but he quickly masked it. "Doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is that woman. She's playing a game, and I've been sent to end it." Clay's mind raced. What game? What's going on here? The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he looked past Clay, toward the darkened street. He scanned the horizon, his hand hovering near his own gun. "She's already made her move. She won't get far." Clay's instincts screamed at him. This wasn't just about a marriage. It was something far bigger, something dangerous. But who was the woman running from? Who had sent this man to track her down? And why had she chosen him to play the role of the husband? The rider mounted his horse again, his eyes never leaving Clay. "You might want to get out of town. Things are going to get ugly." With that, he spurred his horse into motion, galloping off into the distance. Clay stood there for a long moment, his heart still racing, his mind spinning with questions he couldn't answer. He couldn't just leave. He had to know what was going on. He had to find the woman, had to figure out what kind of trouble she had gotten herself into. Without thinking, he turned toward the saloon. If anyone in town knew something, it would be there. The place was always full of gossip, full of people who knew everything about everyone. And maybe, just maybe, they'd know something about the woman. As he approached the saloon, the door creaked open, the warm light spilling out onto the street. The noise inside was a mixture of laughter, shouting, and clinking glasses. It wasn't the kind of place a man would want to go looking for answers. But Clay had learned long ago that sometimes the truth was buried in the places you least expected. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The atmosphere was thick with smoke and the scent of whiskey. A few heads turned as he entered, but most of the patrons were too drunk or too lost in their own business to pay him any mind. Behind the bar, the bartender looked up as Clay approached. "What'll it be?" he asked, his voice thick with the slur of someone who'd had more than a few drinks. "I'm looking for a woman," Clay said, his voice low. "She was here earlier. Tall, dark hair, wearing a fine dress." The bartender raised an eyebrow. "Ain't no shortage of women like that around here. You'll have to be more specific." Clay leaned closer, his hand resting on the edge of the bar. "She was at the church, just got married." At that, the bartender stiffened, his eyes darting quickly around the room. For a moment, Clay thought he might say something, but the man simply nodded and leaned in. "Best keep your distance from that one," the bartender whispered. "She's trouble, and the people she's running with, worse." Clay's brow furrowed. "Who is she?" The bartender shook his head. "I don't know the whole story, but I do know this. She didn't marry for love. She married for something else. And that gun she pulled at the altar, that wasn't for show." Clay's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? The bartender leaned even closer, his breath hot and sour against Clay's ear. She's a pawn in something bigger, Cowboy. You're just the latest in a long line of men who've gotten tangled up in it. If you know what's good for you, you'll leave town. But if you're determined to play the game, then you'd best be ready for what's coming. Clay stood back, his mind reeling from the bartender's words. He had been part of something much larger than he could have ever imagined. The door to the saloon opened, and a cold wind blew through the room. Clay turned, and in that brief moment, he saw her, the woman. She was standing in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the pale moonlight. And in her eyes, Clay saw the storm that had been brewing since the moment he'd met her. She was running, but from what? Clay's pulse quickened as he took a step toward her, ready to finally get the answers he so desperately needed. But the moment he reached for her, the door slammed shut behind him. Clay's hand still hovered near the doorframe, his heart pounding as he watched the woman turn away from the saloon, disappearing into the shadows of the alleyway. For a moment, his mind was frozen, torn between the overwhelming urge to chase after her and the gnawing feeling that this whole affair was more than he could handle. The bartender's warning echoed in his head. She's a pawn in something bigger. Something wasn't right. Everything about this was wrong, starting with the way she had drawn that gun at the altar. But what did it all mean? Who was she really? And what was the danger that seemed to follow her like a storm cloud, darkening everything it touched? Clay's instincts screamed at him to follow her, to find out more about the situation he had stepped into. But part of him wanted to turn around, to walk out of town and forget this whole mess. He could take the $10,000 and leave. But the same feeling that had pulled him into this mess, the same feeling that had kept him from turning away earlier, kept him in place. It was her eyes, cold, desperate, and haunted. She needed something that ran deeper than just a marriage, deeper than the cold transaction they'd made. What kind of woman needed to pull a gun at her own wedding? Clay shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. He couldn't leave without answers. Not now. With a deep breath, he stepped through the door and into the dark street, the cold night air biting into his skin. The town of Rustler's Ridge was as empty as it had ever been. The only sound was the faint echo of his boots against the dirt road and the distant rustle of wind through the trees. His eyes scanned the shadows. There, in the distance, the faint silhouette of the woman appeared again, just as he had seen her earlier. She was walking fast, her heels clicking sharply against the ground. Clay moved quickly, his long stride bringing him closer to her in seconds. "Hold up," he called out, his voice louder than he had intended. The woman stiffened, her shoulders tensing. She didn't turn around immediately. She kept walking, as though trying to escape the sound of his voice. But then, with a resigned sigh, she stopped and slowly turned. "I told you," she said, her voice colder than the night air. "You shouldn't have followed me. I had to know," Clay replied, taking a few cautious steps closer. "Why did you do it? Why the gun at the altar? Why drag me into this?" She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable, as if she was deciding whether or not to trust him. "You want answers, Cowboy. You're not going to like them. Try me," Clay said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't just pull a gun on someone unless there's something bigger at stake. I'm not some fool who's going to just let this slide." Her eyes flickered to the ground for a second, as if the weight of her next words had burdened her. She seemed torn, as though the walls she had built around herself were beginning to crumble. Finally, she looked up at him again, and for the first time since he'd met her, Clay saw vulnerability in her eyes. "I'm being hunted," she whispered, "and you just became part of it." Clay's breath hitched. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "Hunted," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "By who?" "By men who think they can control me," she said, her voice hardening once more. "Men who think that by using me, they can manipulate power. The marriage, the gun, it was all part of the plan. It was never about love. It was about survival. Clay didn't speak. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the whole picture was still unclear. "Who are these men?" he finally asked. "And why involve me?" The woman hesitated. For a brief second, Clay saw a flicker of fear cross her face, quickly masked by cold determination. "They're from the East," she said, her words laced with bitterness. "They're part of a larger network of men who've been controlling towns like this for years. They make their money through illegal deals, through land grabs, extortion, and I was supposed to be their leverage." Clay narrowed his eyes, trying to process her words. "Leverage? Yes," she said, nodding. "They wanted me to marry one of them. I had no choice. My family's estate was taken by them, and they used me as a bargaining chip. But I didn't marry him. Not truly. I made a deal of my own." Her words hung in the air like a cloud of smoke, thick and suffocating. Clay stepped closer, his hand tightening on the grip of his holster. "And what was the deal?" "The deal," she said, a bitter laugh escaping her lips, "was that I would marry whoever they chose, but only long enough to get them to lower their guard. And then I would leave, disappear, and they wouldn't be able to touch me. They had no idea I was planning my escape." Clay's brow furrowed. "But that didn't work, did it?" She shook her head slowly. "No. The man who came for me, he was only a part of the game. He was never supposed to find out what I was really doing. But now that he knows, now that I've betrayed him, he sent someone after me, and I don't know how long I'll be able to stay ahead of him." Clay felt the air in his lungs grow thin. This wasn't just some runaway bride story. This was a tangled web of betrayal, power, and danger. And now, somehow, he was caught up in it. "Who are they?" he asked again, his voice steady. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and raw fear. "They're businessmen. They have connections. But it's not just that. They're using people like pawns on a chessboard. And now that you're involved, they won't stop until they've made sure you can't tell anyone what you've seen." Clay's heart sank. He had no idea what kind of trouble he had stumbled into. All he had known was that he had followed a woman who needed him for some strange reason. Now, that reason had become clear. He was just another piece in their twisted game. Before Clay could respond, the sound of galloping hooves reached his ears again. His head snapped to the side, and there, riding toward them with a grim look on his face, was the stranger from earlier. The man on the horse. Clay's hand went to his gun, but before he could draw it, the man had already dismounted, his eyes fixed on the woman standing before him. "There you are," the stranger said, his voice low, almost tired. "I was wondering when you'd stop running." The woman stiffened, her face hardening. "You're too late," she snapped. "You won't take me." "I don't have to take you anywhere," the man said with a cold smile. "I'm just here to deliver a message." Clay stepped forward, his gun still in hand, but the man ignored him, his attention fixed entirely on the woman. "You know what's coming. There's no escape. We'll find you, no matter where you run. And when we do, there's no more deals, no more games. You're going back." The woman's lips trembled with suppressed rage, but she didn't speak. Clay could feel the tension between them, like the air before a storm. The stranger turned to Clay then, his eyes cold and calculating. "You don't want to get mixed up in this, cowboy," he warned. "You'll only make things worse for yourself." Clay's grip tightened on his revolver, his mind racing. "And what if I don't care about making things worse?" he asked, his voice low. The stranger chuckled darkly, stepping closer, his presence intimidating. "You will. Trust me. You're already in too deep." For a moment, Clay didn't know what to do. He could feel the weight of the gun in his hand, the decision pressing down on him like 1,000 pounds. But in the end, the choice was clear. He couldn't let this woman, this pawn, be dragged back into whatever hell she was running from. Not now. Not after everything she had shared with him. Leave her alone, Clay said, his voice hard. The stranger eyed him for a moment, as if deciding whether to take the threat seriously. Finally, he gave a grim nod. "Suit yourself," he said, his voice laced with menace. "But you'll regret it." And with that, he mounted his horse once more and rode off into the night, disappearing into the darkness from which he had come. Clay turned to the woman, his mind racing. "What now?" he asked. She looked at him, her face pale, her eyes tired but resolute. "Now," she said, her voice steady, "we make a choice. We run, or we fight." And in that moment, Clay realized that he was no longer a cowboy on the edge of nowhere. He had crossed a line, and there would be no turning back. The night was cold, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and made every movement feel like a struggle against the elements. The wind had picked up, and the sky, once clear, was now blanketed with dark clouds. Clay stood at the edge of the town, the sounds of horses fading into the distance, and yet the sense of urgency never left him. His hand still rested on the handle of his revolver, the weight of it a constant reminder of the choice that lay before him. The woman, the mysterious stranger who had drawn him into this nightmare, stood a few steps away from him. Her back was stiff, her eyes focused on the horizon, as though the world around her had already passed her by. She didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. Everything was already said. "You heard him," she said finally, her voice low. "They'll come for us. They won't stop until they get what they want." Clay didn't respond. He didn't need to. What could he say? The stakes were higher now. This wasn't some simple job anymore. This wasn't about money, or even the strange power she had wielded over him since the first moment they met. This was something much bigger, something he didn't fully understand. But he was involved now, and walking away wasn't an option. "Where do we go from here?" he asked, his voice steady, even though his mind was racing. He wasn't used to being out of control, but this was different. He wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting for something that, for the first time in years, actually meant something. The woman turned to him, her eyes narrowed, calculating. For a moment, she looked vulnerable, as though she had let down her guard. But it was fleeting. She was still the same woman who had walked into town with a purpose, who had pulled a gun at the altar, who had dragged him into the depths of this game. "We fight," she said simply. "We don't have a choice." Clay nodded, the decision made. He had no idea what kind of fight they were about to enter, but he knew that he couldn't just stand by and let this woman, this stranger, face whatever was coming alone. Not after everything. He couldn't explain it, but he wasn't about to leave her side now. Not when it had become personal. She moved to one side, toward a nearby shed where the horses were stabled. Clay followed, his boots crunching on the gravel. The wind howled through the trees, and in the distance, he could see the silhouette of the mountains that bordered the town. The storm was coming, and this time, it wasn't just a thunderstorm. It was the storm of their lives. As they reached the horses, she glanced at him. "You don't know what you're getting into, cowboy," she said, her voice quieter now, almost regretful. "These men, they're not like anyone you've ever faced. They've got connections, resources. They'll stop at nothing to get me back." "I've faced worse," Clay replied, his tone gruff. He was used to threats. He'd seen men who'd been backed into corners, and he knew what that desperation looked like. It was a dangerous thing to face, but it wasn't impossible to survive. She turned to face him, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "I don't think you understand. These men don't just kill. They destroy everything you've ever known, everything you've ever loved. They burn things down, and they leave you with nothing. And they won't hesitate to do it to you, too." Clay didn't flinch. He had heard threats like this before, from men who were just trying to scare him. But there was something in her eyes now, something that told him this was real. She was right. This wasn't some ordinary group of outlaws. These men were powerful, dangerous, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. "I'm not afraid of them," he said, "and I'm not leaving you to deal with this alone." She studied him for a moment, as though weighing his words, and then nodded. "All right, then we fight. But know this, it's not going to be easy. We're going to have to outsmart them. We'll need to move fast, and we'll need to be prepared for anything." Clay's jaw tightened. "I'm ready." She turned toward the horses, starting to saddle one of the animals. "We leave at first light. We're heading north, toward the mountains. It's the only place they won't be able to track us. If we can make it there, we might have a chance." Clay nodded, though his mind was still swirling with questions. "What's the plan when we get there?" "We make our stand," she said simply, without hesitation. "We don't run anymore. We fight." As dawn broke over the town, casting the first light of day across the rolling hills, Clay and the woman, he still didn't know her name, rode out of Rustler's Ridge. The town, still shrouded in the aftermath of the night, seemed eerily silent, like it was holding its breath. But Clay knew that it wouldn't be long before the people they were running from came looking for them. The man on the horse, the one who had warned him, had been just the first. There would be more, much more. They rode for hours, the only sounds being the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves against the ground and the occasional rustling of the wind. The sun climbed higher, and the landscape began to shift. The flat plains of Rustler's Ridge gave way to the rugged terrain of the foothills that led toward the mountains. Clay's mind kept drifting back to what the woman had said. "They won't stop until they get me back." Who were these people? Why was she so important to them? And why had she dragged him into this? He wasn't a hero. He was just a cowboy looking for his next job. But now, somehow, he was a part of something far larger than he could have ever imagined. His thoughts were interrupted by the woman's voice. "We need to move faster," she said, her voice urgent. "They'll be following us soon. We don't have much time." Clay nodded and spurred his horse forward, urging the animal to pick up the pace. His muscles ached from hours in the saddle, but the adrenaline coursing through his veins kept him going. The sense of danger that had been growing since the night he met her was now a palpable force, a weight on his chest that made it hard to breathe. For the next several hours, they rode in silence, each of them focused on the road ahead. They knew what was coming, and they knew that it wouldn't be long before they reached the mountains, the last refuge they had. As they neared the base of the mountain range, the landscape became more treacherous. The terrain was rocky and uneven, and the wind had picked up, howling through the narrow passes and sending dust and debris swirling into the air. The air was thin here, and the temperature had dropped sharply. "We're getting close," the woman said, her voice tense. "We need to find a place to hide. If they're following us, they'll know we're heading this way. We need to be smart about this." Clay nodded again, his hand resting on his gun. He could feel the tension in his chest tightening with each step forward. The mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks cutting into the sky like a fortress. But they weren't an escape. They were a battleground. They crested a ridge and descended into a narrow valley, where the trees grew thick and the shadows were deep. This was the place. It wasn't just a place to hide. It was a place to fight. And as they dismounted, Clay could feel the weight of the moment settle in his bones. "Do you have a plan?" Clay asked, looking at the woman as she began tying the horses to a tree. "I've got a few tricks left," she said, her eyes glinting with determination. "But you need to stay close. They're not going to make this easy for us." Clay looked around, his heart racing. The narrow valley had its advantages. It was easy to defend, but it also had its dangers. They were exposed. If the enemy found them, there wouldn't be much room to maneuver. The woman reached into her pack and pulled out a small rifle, checking it quickly before handing it to Clay. "Here," she said. "You'll need this." He took the rifle, weighing it in his hands. It felt foreign, strange in his grip, but he knew how to use it. He'd used everything from pistols to shotguns in his years as a cowboy. This, however, felt different. It wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon for survival. Clay didn't say anything. He simply nodded, accepting the rifle. They were in this together now. And as much as he hated to admit it, he was beginning to understand just how deep this web of deception ran, and how far he'd have to go to survive it. For the first time since he met her, he asked the question that had been gnawing at him. Who are they? The men you're running from? Why is this so important? She glanced at him, her expression hardening. They're not just businessmen. They're part of something bigger, something much darker. You wouldn't understand. But Clay had to know. He had already crossed too many lines to turn back, and the woman, she had already become someone important to him. Try me, he said quietly. She sighed, her breath visible in the cold air. They're part of an old order, the kind of men who've been running things for decades. They don't care about money, not anymore. They want power, control. And I was supposed to be their key to it all. Clay's mind spun. A key. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A key to a system they've built. And when they get their hands on me again, they'll use me to unlock it all. Clay didn't say anything. He couldn't. The weight of her words settled on him like a ton of bricks. He was in deeper than he had ever been, and the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. And as the sound of hooves reached his ears, the final showdown was about to begin.